The old piano sat in the corner of a small living room, looking like it had been forgotten for many years. Dust covered its surface, and the keys were yellowed from age and use. The piano had once been the center of attention in the home. Music had filled the room, and laughter had echoed off its wooden frame. But those days were long gone. Life had become harder, and the piano, once a symbol of joy, had turned into a quiet reminder of better times that seemed far away now. The owner of the piano, a middle-aged person with worn hands and kind eyes, had tried to keep it for as long as possible. It was not just a piece of furniture. It held memories of evenings spent playing simple tunes for friends, for neighbors, for family. Sometimes late at night, the owner would sit in front of it, run fingers over the keys, and remember a younger self, carefree and full of hope. But life had a way of moving forward, and holding on to the piano had started to feel impossible. Bills needed paying, and the small apartment felt crowded with old things that had lost their purpose. One evening, after another day of careful calculation of expenses, the owner made a decision. The piano would be sold. It wasn't easy. The thought of letting go of something so personal made the heart ache. But practicality had its way of winning over sentiment. The piano was listed for sale online for $80. It was not much, but it felt right. It was not about the money. It was about giving the piano a chance to be played again, to bring music into someone else's life. Messages started coming in almost immediately. Some buyers were curious, asking about the condition of the keys or the sound. Others seemed uninterested in the history, the life of the piano, or the joy it had once brought. They treated it as an object, something to own or sell, and that stung more than the thought of selling it cheaply. The owner replied patiently to all messages, knowing that whoever took it home would give it a chance to sing again. Days passed, and many people came to see the piano. Some tried the keys, struck a few notes, and then walked away with polite excuses. Others seemed distracted, checking their phones, as if the piano was just another stop on a long list of errands. Each visit left the owner with a mix of hope and disappointment. There was an unspoken wish that someone would understand the piano, that they would see it not just as wood and metal, but as something alive, capable of touching hearts. Then came the day a message arrived from a man who seemed different from the others. His words were simple and polite. He asked if he could come see the piano in person. When he arrived, he did not rush, did not look around with boredom or impatience. He studied the piano carefully, his hands hovering above the keys without pressing them. There was a gentle curiosity in his eyes, and the owner felt an unusual sense of calm. Something about this man seemed sincere, and for the first time, the idea of selling the piano did not feel entirely sad. He asked questions, but not the kind about price or condition. He wanted to know where the piano had come from, who had played it, and what memories were attached to it. The owner answered, speaking softly, sharing stories of the quiet evenings, of small gatherings where the piano had brought music and laughter. The man listened intently, nodding occasionally, as if every word mattered. The conversation was simple, yet it carried weight. It was a moment that reminded the owner why music mattered, why the piano had always been more than just an instrument. Finally, they discussed the sale. The price was agreed upon $80. It felt strange to put such a small number on something so full of memories, but the man did not seem concerned about money. He smiled politely, handed over the cash, and prepared to take the piano. There was no hurry, no rush. Even as he began to move the instrument, there was a carefulness that suggested respect. The owner watched, a strange mix of relief and curiosity stirring inside. Something about this day did not feel ordinary. Something about this man made the simple act of selling the piano feel like it was the start of a story waiting to be told. As the piano was being lifted and moved, the owner's mind wandered through memories. The first time the piano had arrived, shiny and new, the excitement of learning to play simple tunes, the small triumphs of mastering a piece, and the joy of sharing music with others, all these moments seemed to float in the air. The piano had been a companion through ups and downs, a silent witness to laughter and tears. Giving it away was bittersweet, but there was also hope. Perhaps the piano's next chapter would be even more extraordinary than the past. By the time the piano left the apartment, the room felt emptier than it had in years. The silence was heavy, yet not entirely sad. The owner knew that memories could not be sold or moved. They stayed in the heart. And somewhere in the hands of the new owner, the piano would live again. The thought offered a quiet comfort. Life moved forward, sometimes in small, unexpected ways. And even an $80 sale could carry the weight of 1,000 stories. The owner closed the door, took a deep breath, and smiled faintly, unaware that this ordinary day was about to become unforgettable. The man who had bought the piano arrived at his small home with it carefully loaded into his living room. The space was modest, not large or fancy, but it had a warmth that made the piano feel at home instantly. He set it down gently, taking time to make sure it sat evenly on the floor. There was a care in his movements that suggested respect for the instrument. He did not rush. He did not look around impatiently. Instead, he took a step back and let his eyes rest on the piano for a moment. As if greeting an old friend he had only just met, he ran his hands lightly over the keys, feeling the unevenness of some and the smoothness of others. There was a sense that he could hear more than the sound that came from pressing them. It was as if he could sense the history embedded in the instrument, every note a story, every scratch and mark a memory. He closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply, letting the quiet of the room and the weight of the piano fill him with a sense of connection. It was unusual, but he seemed to have an understanding of what the piano represented. Even if he did not know its full past, curiosity began to spark within him. He had played the piano before years ago, but not for a long time. Life had pulled him in different directions, and the instrument had become something he admired from a distance. But now, here it was, in front of him, ready to be played. He pressed a key softly, letting it sound, and listened. The note was a little dull, slightly off, but it was honest. It spoke of time and experience. He pressed another key, and then another, slowly moving across the keyboard. His fingers were deliberate, not rushed, finding each tone with care. It was a quiet, deliberate exploration, more intimate than performance. Meanwhile, Elle, the owner of the piano back in their apartment, had returned to daily life. They thought often about who had bought it. Did they know the value of what they had received? Did they understand the stories contained in each note? They did not know, and it was not something they could ask. All they could do was hope that the piano would be treated well, that it would find a life as full of music and memory as it had in their home, back in the man's home. He began to play simple melodies. The notes were soft at first, hesitant, almost like testing the piano's response. Then the music grew stronger, more confident. It was as if the piano itself encouraged him, its tones responding to his touch in ways that surprised him. The sound was not perfect, but it carried emotion, sincerity, and presence. He closed his eyes again, feeling each note resonate in the room. There was no one there to hear it but him, and that seemed to make it all the more real. It was private, personal, and important. As he played, he sang softly along with the music. His voice was smooth and calm, carrying a warmth that made the room feel alive. It was not a performance for anyone, not a rehearsal for fame or recognition. It was simply a man and a piano, connecting through sound, finding joy in an ordinary moment that felt extraordinary. The music filled the room gently, spilling out into the hallway, into the small backyard. Birds perched nearby seemed to pause, as if listening. The wind carried some of the melody across the neighborhood. It was subtle, quiet, but alive. Time passed unnoticed. The man moved from one tune to another, his fingers dancing lightly across the keys. Some melodies were familiar, others improvised in the moment. He paused at times, listened, and then continued, never in a rush, never distracted. The piano, old and worn, seemed to respond, each note rich with character. In those moments, the past and present coexisted. The instrument that had once been part of someone else's memories now created new ones. The piano was alive not because of its owner, but because someone understood it. Occasionally, he would stop and stare at the instrument, thinking about the person who had sold it. He wondered if they knew how special the piano really was, if they understood that this exchange was more than a sale. $80 was a small amount, but it was a doorway. It allowed this connection, this music, this story to continue. He felt gratitude for that. He felt respect for the person who had trusted him with something so personal. Neighbors began to notice the music. Some peeked through their windows, curious, surprised to hear such sounds drifting through the quiet streets. It was not loud, not showy, not demanding attention, but it carried presence. One neighbor, a young person with an interest in music, lingered outside, listening with wide eyes. The sound was inspiring, unusual in its honesty, in its warmth. They whispered to another neighbor, trying to identify who was playing. No one knew, but everyone felt the change. Music had a way of doing that, touching hearts unexpectedly. The man played well into the evening. By then, the setting sun had cast long shadows across the room, and the air was filled with a quiet reverence. He paused often, took deep breaths, and simply looked at the piano. There was a sense of awe, not for fame or recognition, but for the simple beauty of connection. In his life, he had experienced much success, failure, joy, disappointment, but this quiet evening, alone with the piano, felt significant in a way that others might not understand. It was personal, private, and profound. At one point, he leaned closer to the piano. Touching the keys softly, almost reverently, he seemed to speak to the instrument without words, a silent communication passing between them. The piano had stories embedded in it, but now it was telling new ones. It sang quietly through his fingers, and he listened. There was no audience, no applause, only the quiet acknowledgement of beauty in motion. As night fell, the man finally sat back and let the piano rest. The room was filled with a gentle stillness, a calm that only music could leave behind. He reflected on the day, on the journey of the piano, and on how something simpler sail, a decision to let go could create a chain of moments that felt larger than life. He felt a quiet smile forming, satisfaction in knowing that music had returned to his life in a way he had forgotten it could dot outside. The neighbors quietly returned to their routines, carrying with them the echo of the music. Inside, the man looked once more at the piano. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, nor did he care. For tonight, this was enough. The piano had found a place where it could be heard, understood, and appreciated. And in turn, he had found a place where he could feel again. Deeply and honestly, through the language of sound and memory, the piano, once forgotten in a small apartment, had begun a new chapter. It was still old, still worn, but it was alive again. And for the man who now held it, the discovery of its music was not just about the notes or the melody. It was about connection, understanding, and the quiet power of something cherished being recognized. The piano, for the first time in years, was singing freely, and the man knew that its story had only just begun. The next morning, the man awoke with a quiet excitement he had not felt in years. The piano had become more than furniture. It was a presence, a companion, a voice waiting to be heard. He moved through his small kitchen, made a cup of coffee, and returned to the living room. The sunlight streamed in through the window, hitting the keys and casting a golden glow across the instrument. The piano seemed to shine not because it was new, but because it was ready again. He sat down, fingers hovering above the keys. The silence was heavy at first, but not uncomfortable. It was a space filled with anticipation. He pressed a key, then another, and soon the notes began to flow. At first, it was careful, exploratory. Each sound a question, each pause a moment of reflection. But gradually he became lost in the rhythm, in the flow of the music. The piano responded eagerly, as if it had been waiting all this time for hands that could hear it. The old keys, worn and yellowed, sang under his touch. As he played, he felt something unusual happening. His fingers moved almost without thought, guided by a deep, instinctive understanding. The melodies were not rehearsed, not memorized. They were spontaneous, rising naturally from the moment. There was an intimacy here that surprised him, a closeness between musician and instrument he had never experienced before. Each note carried emotion, each chord spoke, and the room seemed to hum with life. He started to sing along quietly at first, then with more confidence. His voice was smooth and warm, carrying a presence that seemed larger than the room itself. It was not the kind of singing meant for an audience. It was personal, honest, and full of feeling. The combination of piano and voice created a depth of sound that seemed impossible for such an ordinary-looking instrument. He paused occasionally, listening to the echoes, letting the music settle before continuing. Time slipped away unnoticed. Outside, the sounds began to drift into the neighborhood. Birds perched on trees fell silent, as if listening. A neighbor walking their dog slowed, tilting their head, trying to identify the music. Another peeked through their window, eyes wide with surprise and delight. The music was soft, yet commanding, gentle, yet unforgettable. People did not know who was playing, but everyone could feel the presence. The life, the power in the notes inside, the man was unaware of the attention he was drawing. He was completely absorbed, moving from simple melodies to more complex passages. His fingers flew over the keys with grace and confidence. There was a natural flow, a harmony that seemed to exist between him and the piano alone. The sound was more than music, it was storytelling. Each note carried a piece of his life, each chord a memory, each pause a moment of reflection. The piano was alive, speaking in a language that transcended words. A neighbor finally knocked on the door, politely at first, hesitant. The man looked up and smiled warmly, gesturing for them to come in. The music continued, uninterrupted, but now it had a witness. The neighbor sat quietly, mesmerized, as the melodies unfolded. There was no interruption, no need for explanation. The music spoke for itself, rich with emotion and presence. As the day progressed, more neighbors gathered outside, drawn by the sound. Some stayed at the windows, some in the small yard, listening silently. There was a sense of awe and curiosity, but no intrusion. The music seemed to command respect, holding attention effortlessly. It was a private performance for the neighborhood, yet intimate and personal. Each note resonated not just in the ears, but in the hearts of those who listened. The man continued to play, moving through a range of melodies. Some were slow and contemplative, almost melancholic. Others were bright and uplifting, full of life and hope. He experimented, improvising with rhythm and harmony. The piano responded perfectly, revealing a richness and depth that he had not expected. It was as if the instrument itself had a soul, guiding his hands, shaping the sound, sharing the moment. Hours passed without notice. The room seemed to transform with every note. Shadows lengthened and shortened as the sun moved across the sky. Light played on the keys, highlighting each one in turn, as if marking their importance. He played with increasing confidence, knowing that this was no ordinary session. Something extraordinary was unfolding, a connection between human and instrument that went beyond the physical, reaching into memory, emotion, and something almost spiritual. As evening approached, he felt an impulse he could not resist. He played a familiar tune, one that he had sung long ago in different circumstances. The melody was simple, yet it carried a resonance that was immediate and powerful. He sang the words softly at first, then with growing confidence, letting the sound fill the room. The combination of voice and piano created an atmosphere of warmth and wonder. It was not about skill or perfection. It was about presence, emotion, and connection. At that moment, there was a knock at the door, firmer this time. The man paused, stilling his hands on the keys. He opened the door to see a stranger, someone who looked curious, polite, and respectful. The stranger's eyes widened as he took in the scene, the piano, the man, and the music still resonating in the room. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he stood quietly, listening, letting the sound wash over him. There was a subtle recognition in his expression, a spark of something more than curiosity. The man returned to the piano, inviting the stranger to sit if he wished. The stranger hesitated, then approached, placing his hands lightly on the keys. There was a moment of stillness, a quiet acknowledgement of what was happening. Then, almost imperceptibly, the stranger pressed a key, and a note rang out full and clear. He followed with another, and then another, the music flowing naturally, effortlessly. The man watched, astonished. This was not a simple interaction. This was something extraordinary. The piano seemed to respond to the stranger in a way it had not to anyone else. The notes were richer, the chords fuller, the sound vibrant and alive. The man realized he was witnessing a rare moment, a connection so deep that it felt almost impossible. The stranger's voice joined the piano, smooth and confident, blending perfectly with the notes. The room was transformed. It was no longer just a living room. It was a stage, a sanctuary, a place where music and human presence became one. Neighbors, drawn by the sound, gathered quietly outside, watching through windows and doors, unable to believe what they were hearing. The music carried with it a sense of grace and history, feeling that something monumental was happening in a small, ordinary home. Each note, each chord, each phrase seemed to tell a story of joy, of memory, of life itself. It was a performance without an audience, yet it held everyone in rapt attention. The man could hardly believe what he was witnessing. He had sold the piano for $80, never imagining that it would be played like this, never imagining that someone could bring it to life in a way he had never heard. The room vibrated with music, and with the presence of the stranger, who seemed to command both respect and awe effortlessly. The piano was no longer an object. It was a voice, a living entity, a storyteller, as the sun dipped below the horizon. Casting long shadows across the room, the music continued. The stranger played and sang with a depth of feeling that seemed timeless. Every note carried history, every pause carried emotion, every chord told a story. The man watched, listening, feeling an overwhelming sense of wonder. The piano, once forgotten, had become legendary in those few hours. It had found the hands, the voice, and the heart it had been waiting for all along. By the time the music finally slowed and the last note faded, the room was filled with a quiet stillness that felt sacred. The man and the stranger exchanged a glance, a wordless understanding passing between them. Something extraordinary had happened. Something that would be remembered long after the piano had been sold for $80. The instrument had transformed a simple transaction into a moment of legend. The memory of it would live forever. As the last note lingered in the room, a calm silence took its place. The man, still sitting at the piano, felt a warmth and wonder he could not explain. It had been an ordinary day, a simple sale, yet somehow it had transformed into a moment unlike any he had ever experienced. The stranger, who had played and sung with a natural elegance, now looked at him with a quiet smile, almost apologetic for breaking the spell. Yet fully aware of the weight of the moment, the man took a deep breath, feeling a mix of awe and disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but found that words failed him. How could he describe what he had just witnessed? The piano, old and worn, had never sounded so alive. The music had not just filled the room. It had filled something deeper, something within him. His hands rested lightly on the keys, remembering every note, every chord, every nuance of the voice that had accompanied it. The stranger leaned back slightly, gesturing to the piano as if acknowledging its history and his role in it. "It's a beautiful instrument," he said softly. His voice had the same warmth that had carried through the music. It deserved to be played. There was no boast, no claim of greatness. Just a simple recognition of value, of connection, of respect. Suddenly, a faint whisper from the neighbor outside drew attention. "Wait, is that Dean Martin?" It was almost a question, almost a disbelief. The man at the piano turned sharply, heart racing. Could it be? The stranger's eyes twinkled with a quiet amusement, a knowing smile forming on his lips. He nodded slightly, confirming what had seemed impossible. Dean Martin, the legendary singer, had appeared in his modest living room, playing a piano sold for $80. The realization hit him slowly, like a gentle wave that grew stronger with each passing second. He could hardly comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. Dean Martin, a figure known worldwide for charm, talent, and stage presence, had chosen this moment, this piano, and this room to create something intimate and unforgettable. It was surreal, yet undeniably real. He felt both humbled and honored, caught between excitement and awe. Dean Martin spoke again, his tone calm and sincere. "Some things in life aren't about fame or fortune," he said. "Sometimes it's about the simple joy of music, of connection. This piano spoke to me and I wanted to hear its story. I hope it brings you as much happiness as it brings me." His words were simple, yet they carried the weight of someone who had lived a life full of extraordinary experiences but still appreciated the quiet, authentic moments. The man, still in shock, managed a quiet response. "I never imagined. I sold this piano for $80 not knowing. I didn't know it would." His voice trailed off, overwhelmed by the presence of a legend in his small home. Dean Martin smiled, shaking his head gently. "It's not about the price," he said. "It's about the music, about the life inside it, about the joy it can give. That is worth more than any money." His words resonated deeply. Echoing in the room like the final chord of a perfect song, neighbors began to peek through windows and doors. Realizing that the extraordinary moment they had only heard his music was now being confirmed, the legendary singer Dean Martin had appeared in their neighborhood, choosing this modest home and its old piano for a performance that felt timeless. Whispers of disbelief, awe, and excitement spread quickly. People tried to process what had just happened, their minds grappling with the surreal reality of it all. The man at the piano felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He looked at Dean Martin, his mind racing with questions and admiration. How did he find this piano? Why choose this small home? Dean Martin, sensing the curiosity, laughed lightly. "I like finding simple moments," he said. "Some of the best music comes from unexpected places. This piano called to me. Sometimes, the ordinary holds the most extraordinary surprises." The man nodded, understanding in a way words could not express. It was a lesson about life, about noticing beauty in unexpected places, about the magic that exists quietly around us if we only pay attention. Dean Martin's presence seemed to fill the room with a calm energy, a reminder that greatness could appear in the most unassuming settings. He began to share small stories of his life, his travels, his music, all in a quiet, humble tone that made the man feel as though he were part of something personal and private. There was no fanfare, no performance, just a human connection rooted in shared understanding in the universal language of music. The piano, once forgotten and overlooked, had now become a bridge between ordinary life and legendary presence. Each key seemed to hold more meaning, each note more weight, and each silence more depth. The man realized that the piano had chosen this moment not by chance, but by the quiet pull of something bigger, something almost invisible yet undeniable. It had created a meaning, a story, a memory that would last a lifetime. Dean Martin played once more, softly, gently, letting the room soak in the sound. The music was not for anyone else but the two of them, yet it carried through the walls, reaching those outside who had gathered quietly to witness the event. The man watched, captivated, understanding that he was experiencing a moment few could ever imagine. He felt honored, humbled, and profoundly moved. The music was no longer just sound. It was presence. It was life. It was a story unfolding in real time. Finally. As the evening deepened, Dean Martin stood and nodded, a silent acknowledgement that the moment had been shared fully. The man, still absorbing the magnitude of it all, realized that this day would never be forgotten. The piano, sold for $80, had become part of a legend. Its story now intertwined with one of the greatest voices the world had ever known. It was proof that extraordinary moments could emerge from the simplest decisions, from ordinary actions. And from the courage to let something go and allow life to surprise us, the man closed the door after Dean Martin left. Standing in the quiet room where the piano sat, alive with memory and meaning, he understood with clarity and awe that this was more than a sale. It was a lesson in patience, in the value of simplicity, and in the power of music to connect, to heal, and to inspire. The piano, once a symbol of nostalgia and loss, had become a testament to the unexpected ways life could shine. And in that moment, he knew that he had been part of something timeless. A story that would be told and retold, carrying with it the wonder of that unforgettable day, the day after Dean Martin had left. The man returned to his living room, feeling a strange mixture of emptiness and wonder. The piano sat quietly in its usual place, its keys untouched, yet somehow it seemed different. It was as if the music that had filled the room the night before had left an invisible mark, a memory embedded in the air. Every surface, every shadow, seemed to carry a faint echo of the extraordinary moment. A reminder that something incredible had happened within these ordinary walls. He sat before the piano, fingers lightly brushing the keys, careful not to disturb the silent energy that still lingered. The piano seemed alive in a way that was almost magical. Even without music, it held a presence, a sense of importance in history. He thought about the day it had been sold, how it had gone from a simple object to the center of a story that felt larger than life. $80 had changed hands. Yes. But the real value had been in what the piano had given back in return. An experience, a memory, a connection to something legendary. The man began to tell the story to friends and neighbors, at first quietly, unsure if anyone would believe him. But as he recounted the moment when Dean Martin had appeared, when he had played and sung with the old piano, people listened with wide eyes and open hearts. Each time he told it, he found new details he remembered, new emotions he could describe. The story grew richer, not because he exaggerated, but because the memory itself was vibrant and alive, demanding to be shared. It was not about fame or fortune, it was about something far more human, the way music could touch a soul and how ordinary moments could become extraordinary. The neighbors who had heard the music firsthand shared their own impressions. They spoke about how the sound had seemed to fill not just the room, but the entire neighborhood. The melodies had lingered, even after the piano had gone quiet. People described feeling awe, inspiration, and a sense of calm they could not quite explain. Some said they had gone to sleep that night with the music, still in their minds, as if it had become part of their dreams. The story spread quietly at first, then more openly, until it became a tale that everyone in the area talked about. A legend born from a simple piano and an extraordinary visitor. The man often returned to the piano, not to play, but to reflect. It had become a symbol of possibility, a reminder that life could hold surprises that were unexpected, wondrous, and deeply moving. The memory of Dean Martin playing in his living room reminded him that greatness could appear in the most ordinary of places. It reminded him that simple acts, like selling an old piano, could ripple out into moments that were profound, meaningful, and unforgettable. The story became part of his life, something he carried with him, not as a boast, but as a quiet treasure. Over time, he noticed subtle changes in how he approached life. He became more attentive to small joys, more patient with ordinary moments, more open to the unexpected. He began to understand that value was not always measured in money or fame. The $80 piano sale had been a small, practical decision, but it had opened a door to something immeasurable. He realized that it was not the piano alone that had been important, but the way it had connected him to a greater human experience, the presence of music, the touch of genius, and the wonder of an unforgettable day. The piano itself remained in his living room, cared for with renewed attention. He polished the keys, tuned it carefully, and sometimes played quietly, just to feel the connection again. Each note reminded him of Dean Martin's presence, of the melodies that had once flowed through the room, and of the way music could transform ordinary life. Visitors were drawn to it, not just because it was a musical instrument, but because of the story it carried. Everyone wanted to know how a simple piano sale had turned into a legendary moment. The man told the story patiently, letting the details unfold naturally, emphasizing the human connection, the magic of music, and the unexpected ways life could surprise us. In the years that followed, the story of the piano and Dean Martin became part of the neighborhood's shared memory. It was told at gatherings, in conversations, in quiet moments of reflection. People spoke about it as an example of how ordinary choices could lead to extraordinary experiences. It inspired others to pay attention to the small things, to appreciate the beauty in everyday life, and to remain open to surprises. The man took pride not in having met a celebrity, but in having witnessed a moment of genuine humanity, a shared experience that was timeless and beautiful. The piano, though old and worn, became a symbol of legacy and possibility. It reminded the man and everyone who heard its story that life could hold unexpected gifts, that greatness could appear in humble settings, and that music had the power to touch hearts in ways that words could not. It was more than an instrument. It was a carrier of memory, emotion, and wonder. Every time the man sat at its keys, he felt the invisible presence of that unforgettable day. And he understood that even simple acts could ripple out to create moments that were truly legendary. Looking back, he understood that the sale of the piano for $80 had been a small decision, yet it had unlocked a chain of events that became extraordinary. He realized that the value of an object was not always in what it cost, but in what it could bring to life. The piano had carried memories, emotions, music, and a once-in-a-lifetime encounter that would remain unforgettable. It had transformed a mundane transaction into a story of human connection, joy, and the unexpected ways life could surprise us. The man often smiled to himself, thinking about the day when an ordinary piano sale turned into a legend. He felt gratitude, not just for the experience, but for the lesson it carried, that life was full of small moments waiting to be extraordinary if we noticed them, that music could connect hearts, and that simple decisions could lead to stories worth telling for generations. The piano remained silent at times, singing at others, always a reminder of the day when the ordinary became unforgettable. It stood as a testament to the magic hidden in simplicity, the power of music, and the wonder of life's unexpected gifts. And every time someone asked about the piano, the man would tell the story again, carefully, lovingly, sharing the legend of how an $80 sale became something timeless and truly extraordinary. Even months after that extraordinary day, the piano continued to hold a special place in the man's home, not just as an instrument, but as a symbol of connection, memory, and possibility. Every time he walked past it, he felt a quiet smile form, remembering the magic that had filled the room. He began to notice that his perspective on life had shifted subtly. Ordinary days seemed richer, small decisions felt more significant, and moments that might have been ignored now carried meaning. He started inviting friends and neighbors to see the piano, not to perform, but to share its story. Each time he retold the events, he noticed the eyes of listeners widen, their attention sharpen, their hearts seemingly open to the same awe he had felt. People were drawn not to the piano itself, but to the story of what it had witnessed. It became a conversation piece, a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary objects could carry extraordinary experiences if they were treated with care and attention. One quiet afternoon, he decided to play the piano again. Not to recreate Dean Martin's performance, but simply to reconnect with the instrument and the memories it held. As his fingers ran over the keys, he noticed how responsive they felt, how much life still lived within the old wood and metal. He pressed a chord and felt it resonate through the floor, through the room, through him. The piano was more than an object. It was a companion that had shared in a historic moment. Now it shared a quiet intimacy with him. The music he played was gentle, reflective, and personal. He improvised, allowing melodies to flow naturally, sometimes pausing to listen, sometimes humming softly along. The piano responded as if remembering the voice that had once filled the room. The notes carried warmth, depth, and honesty. Playing it was no longer a technical act. It had become a conversation, a dialogue between his hands and the instrument, a way to honor the extraordinary memory that had been created. Neighbors, passing by, could sometimes hear the faint sound of the piano drifting through the open windows. Some paused, listening quietly, captivated by the gentle music. They did not knock, they did not interrupt. They simply absorbed the sound, letting it fill their thoughts. The piano had become more than a personal treasure. It had become a subtle gift to the surrounding community, a way of sharing joy without words or ceremony. Over time, the man realized that the piano had taught him something essential about life. Its presence reminded him that beauty and significance were often hidden in simple things. A modest instrument sold for $80 had connected him to one of the most iconic voices in music history. It had created a story that would be remembered, retold, and cherished. It had shown him that the impact of a single action could ripple far beyond what one might imagine. He also noticed changes in himself. He approached life with more patience, noticing the details of his surroundings, the subtle rhythms of everyday existence, and the small joys that often went unnoticed. The piano had acted as a catalyst, awakening him to the idea that ordinary moments could carry extraordinary meaning. If they were approached with awareness and openness, each day became a small adventure in noticing the beauty around him. The man began documenting his experience, writing down the story of the piano and the day Dean Martin had played. He described not only the events, but the emotions, the quiet shifts in understanding, and the lingering resonance of the music. He wanted future generations to understand that value was not always monetary, that greatness could appear in the humblest settings, and that life's most meaningful moments were often simple, human, and profoundly intimate. Word of the piano continued to spread. People who had not been present for the original event still came to see it, hoping to sense the magic that had been there. Each visitor left with a sense of wonder, as though the piano itself carried the memory in its very wood and keys. The man would demonstrate simple chords, allowing people to feel the resonance, and then share the story. He noticed that even those who were skeptical at first became captivated. Touched by the narrative and the authenticity of the experience, months turned into a year, and the piano remained a constant presence in the man's life. He played for himself, for friends, for neighbors, and sometimes for no one at all. Each note reminded him of the day when ordinary life had been interrupted by something extraordinary. The memory of Dean Martin's visit remained vivid, a shining thread woven into the fabric of his everyday existence. He understood that the true gift of that encounter was not the celebrity nor the performance, but the reminder that life could surprise you in the smallest and most profound ways. One evening, while playing softly, the man reflected on how far the piano had come. From an old, forgotten instrument sitting in a corner to a central figure in a legendary story, it had transformed the perception of everyone who had encountered it. The piano had shown that even objects considered ordinary could carry profound meaning if approached with care, respect, and love. It had reminded him that every action, every choice, no matter how small, could create ripples.